There is a moment when the empath realizes that his kindness may have turned into prison. And this discovery does not come softly. It comes as a shock. Perhaps part of your life has been built around the needs and expectations of others. Carl Jung understood that transformation begins when consciousness comes into conflict with the image created to survive. For the empath, a dangerous question arises. Who am I when I'm not trying to please anyone? For years, he may have confused love with total availability and compassion for fear of disappointing. The empath observes tones of voice, silences, and mood swings. He notices the discomfort even before anyone speaks. Then it adjusts, avoids conflict, gives space, offers help. He says yes when his deep will said no. Gradually, this pattern ceases to be behavior and becomes identity. Carl Jung called the psychological mask used to occupy an acceptable place in the world a persona. To many empaths, this persona seems noble. The good, understanding, available person. The one who listens to everyone and never creates problems. But what happens when the mask becomes so perfect that the true face is no longer recognized? It is at this point that individuation begins. For Jung, individuating oneself does not mean becoming cold or isolated. It means walking towards one's own totality, ceasing to live only as a response to the world, to discovering an inner center. This process requires courage, because what has been repressed begins to return. After another exhausting day, the empath realizes that he heard problems that were not his, took blame that did not belong to him, and offered energy when he was already empty, until something inside him refuses to continue. Then the question arises that divides a life into before and after. What if I stopped? What if I stopped explaining each boundary? What if I stopped saving those who never wanted to change? What if I stopped interpreting the discomfort of others as a command to abandon myself? These questions touch a deep region of the psyche. Jung knew that consciousness awakens when an old lie ceases to work. For the empath, one of the most powerful is to believe that he is responsible for the emotional balance around him. If someone is sad, he feels he needs to make amends. If someone gets angry, try to calm down. If someone walks away, they try to find out what they did wrong. If someone suffers, he absorbs part of that suffering as if it were proof of love. But what if this constant availability is not freedom? Sensitive people can learn early on that noticing the moods of others helps them avoid rejection or conflict. The body observes, the mind anticipates, personality learns to please. Later, this mechanism is mixed with identity. The individual stops thinking only I help and begins to feel I only have value when I am needed. Here, Carl Jung's vision becomes decisive. That which conscience rejects does not disappear. It is cast into the shadows. The shadow brings together everything that does not match the image shown to the world. In the empath who has built an always kind persona, she can hold a strength that he himself fears to recognize. Anger. Not an empty anger, but the accumulated anger of those who said yes, meaning no, whose it was used because it seemed always available, from those who listened to everyone but were rarely heard. This force is frightening because it contradicts the old image of goodness. But Jung leads us to another perception. Integrating the shadow does not mean obeying destructive impulses. It means recognizing what already exists within us so that we stop acting in hiding. That's why the empath's awakening can be unsettling. He realizes that he doesn't have to destroy his anger to stay loving, deny needs to be generous, or accept invasions to prove compassion. For the first time, strength and sensitivity no longer seem opposed. Then the old identity begins to crack. The empath starts to see situations that he previously justified. He notices when someone uses guilt to obtain obedience and recognizes relationships in which he was valued mainly for what he offered. This clarity hurts because the truth destroys old fantasies. But Carl Jung did not see this destruction as the end. I saw it as a passage. Before a more complete identity can be born, consciousness must realize where it has lived, fragmented. Before finding the self, the individual needs to recognize the masks that he has mistaken for essence. Before psychological sovereignty, it needs to discover how many decisions were born from the fear of losing approval. At this stage, the empath still doesn't know who he's becoming. He just realizes that he can't go back to what he was. There is a distance between what you feel and what you would automatically do. For the first time, there is room for choice. When the psychic energy stops automatically flowing outward, something begins to return to the center. The person still feels deeply and still possesses compassion. But a new question accompanies every impulse to help. Is it born of love or fear, of abundance or guilt, conscious choice or the old need to be needed? Carl Jung would take us to that threshold. The empath has not yet shed all the masks, has not set all the limits, and has not completely recovered his voice. But the unconscious has already been touched. The shadow began to respond. And once the truth is seen, it cannot be totally forgotten. From here, the signs become visible. And the first of them is almost silent. The energy that once belonged to everyone is slowly beginning to return to those who should always have possessed it. There is a change that almost no one notices when it starts. The empath still answers messages, listens to problems, and feels the environment intensely. On the outside, it looks like the same person, but inside, something stopped obeying automatically. Carl Jung would understand this moment as the gradual return of psychic energy to the center. What for years was thrown out begins to come back, and when that happens, the relationships around you feel it first. Imagine a simple situation. Someone calls at the end of the day to unload another crisis. Before, the empath would interrupt his own rest, listen for an hour and end the conversation, carrying an anguish that was not even his. Now, for the first time, he looks at his phone and thinks, I can't do that today. The gesture seems small, but psychologically, it is huge. He didn't stop caring. He has only begun to recognize that his energy also has a limit. This is the first sign. The energy stops compulsively flowing everywhere. After a difficult conversation, he no longer spends the whole night trying to mentally solve the other's life. When entering a heavy environment, he perceives the tension without assuming that he needs to eliminate it. When someone is angry, they don't immediately turn that mood into personal responsibility. Change produces strangeness. Some people say he seems distant, and some try to provoke the old reaction, increasing the urgency or disappointment. Human systems get used to roles. When a role changes, the whole balance needs to be reorganized. It is then that the second sign appears. The persona begins to crack. Carl Jung called the face we present to the world a persona. The problem arises when the person starts to believe that it is the mask. For many empaths, this persona was built as someone kind, available, and patient. But there is an uncomfortable question. How much of this goodness was choice, and how much was fear of displeasing? Everyday life reveals the answer. They ask him where he prefers to sit, and he replies, whatever. He wants to rest, but accepts the invitation. He wants to refuse a favor, but he says yes and suffers afterwards. Gradually, he begins to say simple things. I prefer this place. Today I can't. I don't agree. I need to leave. For those who observe from the outside, these are common phrases. For those who have lived years adapting, they are acts of individuation. And here appears an unexpected turn. The empath imagined that, by being more truthful, he would immediately feel peace. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes fear arises. The heart races after a no. The mind reviews the conversation. He wonders if he was rude. Jung helps us understand why. The old persona does not disappear without resistance. It was built to ensure belonging. Abandoning it may seem to lose protection. The third sign comes as projections begin to return home. Jung showed that we often see in others contents that belong to our own psyche. The empath can project his loyalty, honesty, and capacity to love onto people who have not shown to possess these qualities. He thinks, she's just hurt. He didn't mean it badly. Deep down, this person has a good heart. Sometimes that's true. Other times, it is hope placed on facts that say otherwise. Think of someone who promises to change over and over again, but reverts back to the same behavior. The empath hears the apology and believes again. After months or years, he begins to notice a decisive detail. Exciting words do not cancel repeated patterns. This is one of the most difficult points of awakening. To see the truth means to lose certain fantasies. The empath stops asking only what someone feels and begins to observe what that person does. Stop falling in love with potential and pay attention to reality. Clarity can seem cruel in the face of the old naivete. Carl Jung would say that recovering a projection is recovering part of one's own energy. That which was attributed to the other returns to consciousness. The empath realizes that the depth he admired was perhaps in part his own reflected depth. Then we come to the fourth sign, the one that most visibly alters relationships. Limits become sacred. not sacred in the sense of rigidity, but because they come to protect something essential. The empath begins to treat their own time and energy as elements that deserve respect. He doesn't need to come up with elaborate excuses to refuse. He only acknowledges that I can offer. I can't do that. It is at this moment that some relationships show their true structure. A person who is used to calling at any time gets angry when he receives no answer. A family member says that the empath is different because he refuses an old obligation, and a painful discovery arises. Those who respect you adapt to your limits. Those who depended on their absence try to make him feel guilty. But true boundary is not born of anger. It is born of integrity. Jung understood that maturing psychologically requires a deeper relationship with one's own inner signals. The empath begins to hear the discomfort before exhaustion. Notice when a conversation empties you. He recognizes that saying no early can prevent resentment later. From there, something mysterious begins to happen. People change places around him. Some approach more respectfully, others disappear. Some try to restore the old version using an extremely effective weapon, guilt. And that's exactly where the next transformation begins. Because when the empath learns to sustain a limit, even in the face of the disappointment of others, one of the oldest chains of his life slowly begins to lose strength. Guilt is often the last chain to break, because for years it has disguised itself as conscience. But Carl Jung forces us to look deeper. What if part of that guilt comes from the fear of losing love, approval, and belonging? As individuation progresses, he realizes that he has spent years confusing responsibility with submission. Imagine an ordinary scene. Someone asks for a favor at the worst possible time. Before, the answer would be immediate. Of course I do. Now there is silence. The mind recognizes that saying no does not destroy a healthy relationship. The old reflex tries to return, but the integrated shadow returns something repressed: firmness. The fifth sign appears when guilt loses authority. It may still arise, but it no longer decides everything. The empath understands that not all discomfort means error. Sometimes it's just the price of abandoning an old pattern. When someone says, "You've changed," they no longer rush to recover the old image. Change begins to mean awareness. But what happens when the person who has always sought approval discovers that being accepted can cost him his or her own truth? Carl Jung saw authenticity as a requirement of individuation. Then comes the sixth sign: authenticity over approval. The empath fails to adjust each sentence to prevent any negative reaction. He just begins to say what he thinks, admit what he feels, and recognize what he wants. This shows in the details. He doesn't laugh just to alleviate a situation. He does not say, "It doesn't matter to me," when he has a preference. He does not feign enthusiasm to avoid disappointment. You can disagree without imagining that the relationship will be destroyed. An uncomfortable truth emerges. Some people enjoyed his presence. Others mostly enjoyed his adaptation. Jung then leads us to the archetype of the wounded healer. Sensitive people recognize suffering because they know pain from within. But there is a trap: taking care of others to avoid one's own wounds. The seventh sign is born when the healer turns to himself and asks, "What in me is also asking for attention? Who would stay close to you if you never had to prove that you deserve to be there again?" This question changes habits. Instead of spending the night solving someone's crisis, the empath realizes his own tiredness. Instead of counseling everyone, he observes their anxiety, their resentment, and their ignored needs. And he notes something disturbing. Perhaps the pain of others was easier because it gave him a function. Carl Jung would understand this as the collection of projected energy. The empath ceases to invest all his psychic strength in saving the external world. Part of this energy returns to the interior. With it, a forgotten question reappears. What would I do with my life if I didn't have to be indispensable to anyone? The eighth sign is born from this space: conscious connection. The empath does not stop loving and does not become indifferent. Now you can stay present without disappearing into the other. They can listen to pain without turning it into an obligation, offer support without promising rescue, and acknowledge each person's responsibility. What if the need to be needed has hidden, for years, the fear of discovering who you are without this role? Before, feeling meant absorbing. Now, feeling becomes perceiving. Before, to love meant to carry. Now, loving can mean staying close without preventing the other from facing your choices. For Jung, A conscious relationship requires two individuals capable of existing without transforming a bond into a fusion. But there is a price. The more aware the empath becomes, the more visible dependency-based relationships become. Some people walk away. Others use guilt or nostalgia. You got cold before I could count on you. These phrases may hide a truth. Before, perhaps they could also count on their self-abandonment. Then comes the crossing that Jung would associate with the descent necessary before a new integration. The empath can no longer live as before, but he has not yet completely built his new identity. There is silence where there was urgency. There is space where there were people demanding their energy. And that space can seem daunting. But which version of you is really afraid? The one that's being born, or the one that realizes it's losing control? It is possible to miss even relationships that were bad, not because they were healthy, but because they were family. The psyche recognizes patterns known as safe territory. Therefore, the empath may feel like going back, explaining too much, or apologizing for their limits, just so as not to face the loneliness of a changing identity. This is one of the most profound turns of individuation. Something needs to end. The persona that believed it had value only when it was useful and necessary. Grief also happens for the character who kept the empath safe for years. Letting him go takes courage. Gradually, silence ceases to look like punishment. The empath realizes that he can rest without justifying, feel anger without becoming cruel, and love without promising to save. The shadow no longer appears only as darkness. It begins to give back lost parts, firmness, desire, direction, and courage. What if what seemed like a loss was actually the recovery of everything you had to let go of to be accepted? It is just when this old identity begins to lose strength that an unexpected revelation emerges. The transformation is no longer just psychological. The body, which for years has remained on alert, begins to respond to the new way of existing. The next stage can be felt in the flesh itself, as if the organism finally realizes that it no longer needs to carry the whole world. There is an instant when the empath realizes that the body knew before the mind. There were still no words to explain what was happening, but there were signs. Tiredness after certain conversations, tension when entering some environments, difficulty relaxing even when nothing serious was happening. Carl Jung understood that what does not find space in consciousness seeks another way to appear. For those who have lived for years absorbing the emotional climate around them, the body can become the place where excess leaves its marks. Think of a common scene. You come home after a seemingly quiet date. Nothing visible happened. Even so, your shoulders are stiff and there is an intense need to be alone. For a long time, the empath interprets this as weakness. Then he notices a pattern. Certain encounters do not tire him for the time they last, but for the role he occupies within them. There are people before whom he feels he must watch every word. Others arrive loaded with problems and leave lighter, while he ends up heavier. The mystery begins when he realizes that he called normal what kept him on his toes. Jung might say that transformation begins when the individual stops asking, "What is happening to them?" and starts asking, "What happens to me when I am around them?" This question changes the direction of consciousness. Instead of investigating only the external world, the empath observes his own reaction, and he discovers that the body often reveals limits that the mind still tries to negotiate. Then something unexpected happens. When you respect these signs, some relationships improve. A friendship endures a no without drama. A family member learns to ask before demanding. One partner respects silence without interpreting it as rejection. He hoped that every limit would lead to abandonment. He discovers that healthy relationships survive him, but other relationships follow the opposite path. People who seem close to him start to move away just when he is no longer available all the time. Some become critical. Others create small crises, as if they wanted to test whether the old version still exists. Jung understood that every interchange alters bonds. It is at this moment that the great separation arises. Relationships based on true exchange adapt. Relationships based on dependence begin to creak. The empath discovers an invisible contract. I offer unlimited emotional availability, and you offer me belonging as long as I remain useful. The shock is also in recognizing how many times he collaborated with this contract. For fear of losing people, he offered more than he could. For fear of seeming selfish, he accepted invasions. Out of fear of conflict, He taught others that his energy was always available. Jung leads us to a difficult truth. Becoming conscious is also recognizing the patterns we have held. And then the sensibility changes its nature. Before, any intense emotion around seemed like an order. If anyone was sad, the empath needed to console. If someone was angry, they needed to calm down. If someone was disappointed, they needed to make amends. Now, there is a gap between perceiving and acting. It seems small, but it is in it that freedom is born. Sensitivity ceases to be a permanently open door and becomes discernment. The empath continues to pick up nuances, but begins to separate. This is mine. This belongs to the other. This deserves my attention. This doesn't need to enter me. Jung would see this differentiation as essential for individuation because the individual learns to stay connected without dissolving his own identity. The less the empath tries to save everyone, the clearer his perception becomes. The energy previously spent on anticipating reactions returns to observe accurately. He perceives contradictions and repeated patterns, not because he was suspicious, but because he stopped covering reality with automatic excuses. A person says they love you, but disrespects your boundaries. Another claims that she needs him, but disappears when he needs help. A third reacts angrily whenever he chooses himself. Before, the empath would look for an explanation that would preserve the bond. Now, observe the pattern. Sometimes the biggest revelation is not to find out who the other is, but to realize how long it took to believe what you were already seeing. From this awareness, an inner code is born, to feel deeply without absorbing everything, giving when there is energy, to love without abandoning one's own identity, help because there is choice, not guilt, trust the internal signal before obeying external pressure. These are not rigid rules. They are ways to protect a truer relationship with oneself. The change causes another consequence. When the empath is no longer the place where everyone deposits emotions without responsibility, some people start to call it cold. For years, being good was part of his identity. Being accused of selfishness touches an old wound. But now there is a difference. He's seen too much to go back completely. He recognizes the price of saying yes when he wanted to say no. He begins to realize that kindness without conscience can turn into self-destruction, and that compassion without borders can sustain unbalanced relationships. Carl Jung leaves us with a decisive question. What if what the world calls selfishness is, at certain times, only the birth of integrity? The empath will still have to separate care from submission and figure out how to be receptive without getting lost again. Because the next stage is not learning to feel less. It is learning to remain whole while feeling deeply. When the empath begins to choose himself, someone almost always comes along to say that he has changed too much. Sometimes, the accusation comes disguised as concern. Other times, it's direct. You've gotten selfish. This is where Carl Jung becomes even more important, because individuation requires distinguishing destructive egoism from integrity. The first ignores the others. The second prevents the individual from disappearing into them. For a long time, the empath believed that being good meant always being available. Help, give in, understand, forgive. But when he begins to protect his own time, he realizes something uncomfortable. Some people don't miss him. They miss the version that never said no. This discovery reveals that certain bonds depended on their lack of boundaries. Tension grows when a family member asks for something at the last minute, a friend demands attention in exhaustion, or a partner turns frustration into demand. The old impulse appears, to give in to avoid conflict. But now, there is awareness. He realizes that saying yes to keeping the foreign peace can mean declaring war on himself. Carl Jung would then lead us to the problem of integration. The empath does not need to become hard to stop being exploited. It needs to join forces that previously seemed incompatible: receptivity and firmness, sensitivity and assertiveness, care and independence. This internal union is a form of psychological marriage. He could associate strength with coldness. He imagined that imposing limits would make him what he feared most. But experience shows something else. You can refuse without humiliating, disagree without destroying, and love deeply by saying, "I don't accept that." Force ceases to be violence and becomes structure. This change produces a quiet turnaround. The less energy he spends trying to be accepted, the more energy he has left to see. The intuition becomes clearer, creativity returns, even relationships change. More reciprocal people begin to occupy spaces previously dominated by necessity. Jung would say that the psyche recovers parts of itself when it stops throwing all its energy into the external world. The empath rediscovers forgotten tastes, interests, and desires. The essential thing is to realize that your life has content even when no one is asking for anything. And then a phase arises that can be frightening: solitude. For years, the empath was surrounded by people who needed him. When this dynamic subsides, silence can feel like abandonment. For some time, he may wonder if he has done something wrong, but there is a difference between loneliness and solitude. In solitude, we feel the absence of connection. In solitude, we begin to feel the presence of ourselves. Carl Jung understood recollection as a necessary passage in certain moments of individuation. Without silence, it's hard to figure out which thoughts really belong to you. At first, this encounter can be uncomfortable. The empath knows how to answer what everyone wants, but hesitates when he asks what he himself wants. He recognizes the mood of a room, but he may not know how to identify his own dreams. The irony is clear. He spent years getting to know everyone around him and remained a stranger to himself. It is in this territory that something new is born. The empath learns to enjoy an afternoon without explaining his absence. He discovers that he does not need to fill all the silence with messages, favors, or problems from others. For the first time, being alone stops feeling like rejection and starts feeling like space. But Jung would not point to isolation as a destination. Individuation matures when the individual returns to the world without abandoning his own center. The empath returns to relationships, but now participates by choice. It helps when there is real availability. He listens when he can be present. He loves without transforming love into a rescue mission. This return changes the way he perceives people. Before, he looked for those who needed him. Now he recognizes those who can walk alongside him. Before, crises activated his role as savior. Now he values reciprocity and respect. What once seemed like intensity can start to look like chaos. And here comes one of the biggest twists and turns of this stage. When the empath stops trying to be indispensable, he discovers who really wants his presence. Some relationships disappear, but others become more true. People who respect boundaries don't demand performances. The accusation of selfishness loses strength. The empath understands that taking care of oneself does not mean putting oneself above others. It means to stop always putting yourself down. You can remain generous, but generosity is no longer born of fear. It may remain sensitive, but sensitivity ceases to mean invasion. Carl Jung would then bring us closer to the self, the broader center of the personality, where contradictory parts cease to struggle and begin to form a whole. The empath realizes that he does not have to choose between being delicate and strong. It can be both. You don't have to choose between connection and independence. You can love and remain whole. But there is a danger that has not yet disappeared. The old patterns know deep paths within the psyche. On a tired day, guilt can return. In front of an important person, the fear of rejection can reappear. A crisis can awaken the savior again. And just when the empath believes he has changed, the old identity can knock on the door using a familiar voice. That's when the journey stops being just a discovery and becomes a test. Waking up once is just the beginning. True sovereignty will be measured when all that he has abandoned tries to convince him to return. When the old patterns return, the empath finds out if it has really changed. It's easy to maintain a limit when no one is pressing. The test begins when a charge, a disappointed person, or the feeling that saying no can cost love. Carl Jung would understand this moment as part of individuation. Transformation returns in cycles, but with a different consciousness. The empath may feel guilty again. You may want to explain yourself too much, or save someone who didn't even ask for help. This does not mean failure. Now there is space between impulse and action. Before, he obeyed automatically. Now he observes. Jung helps us realize that consciousness does not mean eliminating the shadow, but recognizing it. The goal is not to stop feeling guilt or fear of rejection. It is to prevent these forces from governing life. The empath matures when he feels the pressure and stays true to what he knows to be true. In practice, the first step is to stop before answering. When someone makes a request, don't say yes out of reflex. Ask, do I want to do this? Do I have energy? Am I choosing, or am I afraid of disappointing? This pause breaks years of automatism. The second step is to observe the body. If you get tense around certain people or end up on dates exhausted, don't ignore these signs. Often, the body perceives a boundary before the mind admits it. The third step is to say no without turning the limit into an attack. You don't have to prove that someone is evil to recognize that something doesn't work for you. You can say, "Today I can't. This exceeds my limit." Then comes something more difficult. Stop rescuing. The conscious empath does not abandon those who suffer, but neither does he take over the life of the other. It can offer presence and support, but it doesn't have to carry an entire person on its back. Jung would remind us that no one can accomplish the individuation of another person. This change transforms love. Before, love could mean unlimited availability. Now, love includes truth. You can love and disagree, you can walk away, and you can refuse manipulation. Maturity begins when love no longer requires self-abandonment. There is also a silent step, recovering one's energy. Walk, write, resume abandoned interests, and notice what arouses curiosity when no one is telling you who you should be. Solitude ceases to be empty and becomes an encounter with oneself. It is in this space that the empath approaches the self, a central concept in Carl Jung. The self is not a perfect version. It is a totality capable of bringing together the sensitive and the firm, the welcoming and the independent, those who help and those who also need to receive. This changes the empath's mission. Before, he got into every emotional fire because he believed his worth depended on putting out the fire. Now he learns to be like a lighthouse. A lighthouse illuminates and guides, but it does not abandon its base to chase each lost vessel. This image sums up psychological sovereignty. The sovereign empath does not become indifferent. It becomes stable. Feel no less. Sit with awareness. He loves no less. He loves without disappearing. Help by choice, not by guilt. When the old voice comes back telling you that you're being selfish, remember, you're not putting your life above others. He is just failing to put it down all the time. He is not abandoning compassion. He is including himself in it. Carl Jung dedicated his work to the process of becoming what we are in a more complete way. This path requires courage because each step threatens versions built to please, belong, or survive. The persona can protect, but also limit. Therefore, choose a concrete action. Identify a situation in which you usually say yes out of guilt. Observe a relationship in which you feel responsible for emotions that are not yours. Recognize a deferred need. Then do something small but real toward yourself. Maybe it's saying no without making an excuse. Maybe it's answering a text tomorrow, stopping trying to convince someone to change, or simply resting without asking permission. The size of the action matters less than its meaning. Over time, these small acts form a new identity. The boundary that caused guilt begins to produce peace. The silence that seemed to be abandonment is transformed into presence, and the sensitivity that seemed condemnation reveals another nature, perception without slavery. So we return to the question that opened this journey. What happens when the empath stops pleasing everyone and starts to see the truth? He does not become cold. He does not lose compassion. Learn to direct it to you as well. He does not abandon love. He abandons the idea that loving requires disappearing. This is what transforms the empath into someone sovereign, to feel deeply without absorbing everything, to help without destroying oneself, and to look at the shadow without denying one's own light. Perhaps its breaking point was the first sign that an old life could not continue. Perhaps what you called loss initiated individuation. If this message has found a part of you tired of carrying everything in silence, start. Protect, limit. Collect a portion of your energy. If this video made sense to you, like it so it reaches more people. Comment on what marked you the most. If you prefer, you can comment anonymously or write just a short sentence. And subscribe to the channel to continue exploring Carl Jung's ideas, the shadow, individuation, the self, and the path to a more conscious life. Because maybe true transformation doesn't start when the world understands you. Maybe it starts when you stop abandoning yourself to being understood. From that moment on, the empath no longer needs to ask permission to exist entirely.